Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm finally bringing you my favorite books of 2024. Normally, I put this video up in December, but because we were traveling, we went to Japan, we went to this beautiful place called Yuzawa Onsen in the snow. We took some time off, we helped a family member move. It's been a whole enormous whirlwind, but we're finally here, we're home, and I am ready to tell you about my favorite books that I read in 2024. This is basically my favorite video that I film every year. I have my 10 favorite books that I read this year. I also have a few cheeky honorable mentions because I'm very bad at sticking to a specific list of favorite books. I never can really narrow it down. And then at the end, I'm also going to tell you my 5-star rereads because I quickly want to just let you guys know what I've been rereading this year. But all of those rambles and explanations aside, I'm now going to jump into the video. Here are my 10 favorite books that I read in 2024. Starting with the honorable mentions. So the very first one is Susanna Clarke's The Wood at Midwinter. I think this is a beautiful little coffee table book. It's basically a short story. The illustrator's name is Victoria Sordon and she did an absolutely amazing job at these illustrations. They're so pretty and they really add to this story. But again, I just want to really stress it is a short story. Do not go in expecting a novel. I really did enjoy this. I thought it was beautifully done. I thought it was a very sweet little story. But because I love Susanna Clarke, like I adore Piranesi, I adore Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. These are two of my favorite fantasy books of all time. I just went in with really high expectations. So this was really good. I thought it was lovely. Don't go in expecting Piranesi though. This is a short story. It's really brief. Next honorable mention is Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. I got a bit confused reading this book. I was certain that Evelyn was a woman because I didn't realize that that was a gender neutral name. And so I read through most of this book and I was like, oh, it's so interesting that there's not more people celebrating this really talented female author from the 1920s. And then I turned the book over and saw the picture of the author on the back. I really enjoyed this. So I picked this book up, A, because I read so many books from the 1920s. I wrote a novel named Project Teacup, which is loosely inspired by the 1920s. And I really must say loosely because it's a secondary world story, and so it's entirely set in a magical fantasy world with demons and spirits and lots of cool speculative things going on. But there are just some bits of the world building that are inspired by a kind of 1920s time period. And so I've picked up so many books written in the 1920s and the 1930s and the kind of intra-war years. And I also wanted to pick up this book because supposedly it inspired The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And honestly, reading this book, I can definitely see it. We have the main character who's, I believe, a general or someone significant in World War II, looking back on his Oxford years and the time of his youth and the friends that he made and the expensive house that they used to go to. If you've watched Saltburn, I think this was also a bit of an inspiration for Saltburn, but without any of the really, there are some moments in here that clearly have inspired both The Secret History and also Saltburn. I really enjoyed it. I thought the writing was really beautiful. And then the final honorable mention I wanted to say is The Grace Keepers by Kirsty Logan. I thought it had such beautiful atmospheric world building. It's this really interesting kind of literary leaning style, but just beautifully speculative, beautifully imaginative. This story is about two women who are named North and Kalanish. North lives on a circus boat with her like pet bear who she performs in the circus with. And in this world, the earth is covered in ocean and the circus boat travels around to all these islands performing. Sorry, the air conditioner is now going to kick in because it is the dead of summer and it's very warm in here, so I'm sorry about the audio. And then the second woman that the story is about is named Kalanish and she lives out in the ocean and she's a kind of undertaker funeral director. Like in this world, the bodies of the dead need to be buried at sea in this very certain way, and the Graces are these birds who are kept in cages, and the story is just so unique and beautifully done and I really loved it. We can now move on to my proper top 10 of 2024, kicking off with The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. Now we read this book and actually many of these books for the book club that I run over on Patreon. I love the work of Kazuo Ishiguro. Never Let Me Go. This guy, Never Let Me Go, which I've spoken about to death on my channel. I love this book. I read it in high school. It's this amazing speculative book. I can't tell you anything about the story really because it'll kind of spoil the story, but it's kind of like a boarding school novel. And really what I'm looking for is this exact same book again, but with a plot I haven't read. And so I keep picking up Kazuo Ishiguro's those books, like wanting to find another Never Let Me Go. And I loved this book. I thought it was amazing. I thought it was beautifully written, absolutely masterful prose from Kazuo Ishiguro. The characterization was beautifully done. There was such a gentle, tragic subtext to all of the characters. Like, you kind of had to read between the lines to really understand and fully feel the tragedy of this story, but it was really, really cleverly done. It was not the same as Never Let Me Go though, so if it had have been, it probably would have been higher up on my list. The story is about a butler whose name is Stevens, and it's about his life as a butler and what it means to wait on people and to serve people, and the way that this man has sort of been taught to put the duty of being a butler and serving above his own wants and needs. The next one is The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. It's this intense, gritty dystopia that does not in any way pull its punches. There's a lot of content warnings in this story. There's a lot of like harsh content, violent, potentially upsetting content in here, which I was fine with, but which like could be upsetting to some people, I understand. But the way this dystopia was done was so realistic. It was so suspenseful. As I said, it didn't pull its punches at all. Like, it really, really did feel like what would happen if you lived in a dystopian world. This story, to explain the plot, is an epistolary novel, so it's told in diary entries of our main character, whose name is Lauren Olamina, and we start off when she's quite young and we follow her experiences as she navigates living in a dystopian version of the United States of America. She lives in what would have been California area. This book was written in the 1990s and the very first date is July 20, 2024. But there's a lot of really interesting prophetic stuff in here, which makes the read quite spooky. Kind of like how The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood feels like it could have been written last year, but it wasn't. It was written in the 80s. So for that reason, this is a really timeless and brilliantly done sci-fi dystopia. I will say the sci-fi elements, the kind of speculative elements, are pretty gentle in this story. Like, there's a kind of nod to a magic system. There's a kind of nod to certain things that wouldn't really be realistic, but it doesn't have a massive impact of the story. I can now really clearly see the inspirations of Parable of the Sower in N.K. Jemison's work, so if you've read the 5th season and you really like it, please go read this book. The next book is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read the ebook version of this, and I have been hounded to read this book for so many years because it's one of my best friend's favorite books. Also because Rebecca is clearly inspired by Jane Eyre, and Jane Eyre is obviously a bit inspired by the fairy tale of Bluebeard, and all of these stories have different bits and pieces and themes that I really love and I'm really interested in, and just this is very much my vibe is what I'm saying, and I don't know why I waited so long to read Rebecca, but I finally read it this year. So Rebecca is the story of a young woman who marries this kind of mysterious man, and she goes to live with him in his manor house. This trope is so commonly done in gothic stories because it's kind of the Jane Eyre Bluebeard trope. Her new husband, who is much older than her, and he has a lot of money, he's very rich, and then she starts to find out bits and pieces about his previous wife, whose name was Rebecca. Rebecca, who was beautiful and charismatic, and we're not really sure what's happened in the marriage. It was beautifully told, very suspenseful. Despite the fact that I've read Jane Eyre a number of times and I've read so many novels that have leveraged this kind of same structural archetype, I love this story. I found parts of it really suspenseful. I thought some parts like turned the structure on its head a little bit. I thought it was really, really engagingly written. I loved the imagery. I thought the grounds were so beautifully depicted in this story. And overall, I just really, really enjoyed it. It was a surprisingly easy read. I read it really quickly. The next one I've already spoken about a bit so far, and it is the first 1Q84 book. Now, 1Q84 is a story by Haruki Murakami, and I love Murakami. I've read so many of his stories. As always, a bazillion different content warnings, especially in this book. Like, it's just, he goes dark and twisted real quick. I'm now about halfway through the second 1Q84 book, but I am thoroughly enjoying this story. I'm definitely going to finish it, and it's definitely one of my favorite things I've read so far this year. So we have two point of view protagonists in this story, one whose name is Aomame and one whose name is Tengo. This book is set in the year 1984, but in a kind of alternate reality 1984, where some certain little things aren't quite the same. 1Q84 is a play on words because the Japanese word for 9 is ku or cute, and so it's like Q for like question mark, but also cute for like the number 9, obviously. And we oscillate between these two characters, one of whom, Tengo, is a writer and cram school teacher who meets an enigmatic teenage girl whose name is Eriko Fukada. She gets called Fuku Eri, and the working relationship he has with her. And we also follow Aomame, who is kind of this like interesting Vizio, but also kind of assassin. The way the story oscillates between the two characters is really brilliantly brilliantly done. The book is so engagingly written. I love this world. I love that it's set in 1980s Tokyo in the kind of standard Haruki Murakami magical realism kind of way. The world is not quite what it seems, and there's a kind of underbelly under the city of secret organizations and cults going on and weird stuff happening. I have finished the first one and I am really, really enjoying it. The next book is Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. So, Parable of the Sower is the first book, Parable of the Talents is the second book. This is a duology, and anything that I thought wasn't perfect was absolutely fixed in this book. I thought this was excellent. This book blew me away, and I loved this story. I thought it was so brilliantly done. I can't explain to you the specific thing that I loved about the story because it's kind of a spoiler for the end of this book, but there's some things in this story that kind of turns the structure of this guy on its head and you see things from a different perspective. I think the world building in this story was really, really strong. I particularly love the characterization in this story. I thought it was excellently done. It's one of the rare times that a sequel has, in my opinion, been better than the original book. And also, this is my absolutely favorite ending of a dystopian story that I've read. I think the ending of this book wraps up the duology really, really beautifully. I just thought this was so brilliantly done. I'd love to reread these books eventually. Such a masterclass in amazing dystopia sci-fi storytelling. The next book is a collection of short stories by Susanna Clarke called The Ladies of Grace Adieu. These stories are set in the world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is one of my favorite books of all time, as I've already mentioned. I love this collection of short stories. I love particularly how different the voices were between the stories. I think that Susanna Clarke tried to do some really interesting experimental things here, but I also love that most of the stories felt like they very much matched the tone of Jonathan Strange. The titular story, The Ladies of Grace Adieu, follow more of the women in the Jonathan Strange world, which is really lovely to see. I think all of the short stories in this book were really, really strong and really interesting. They were all really punchy and vibrant, and we had this Susanna Clarke tone and voice, whereas this guy didn't really feel as much Susanna Clarke as her other work does. So anyway, if you want to read some Susanna Clarke short stories, I would recommend Ladies of Grace Adieu over The Wood at Midwinter. The four final books on this list were all really similar in terms of how much I loved them, so it was really, really, really hard to pick between the top four. So kicking it off with number 4, which is Orbital by Samantha Harvey. This was the Booker Prize winner. I recently read this in a vlog. I listened to the audiobook version of it. My mother-in-law, who was an angel, she's so sweet, she watched the vlog and she realized that I couldn't get a copy because it's sold out, and so while we were in Japan she went out and bought me a copy, which was very, very sweet of her. But it's this very beautiful story which can really only be described as nature writing, but in space. So you can kind of say it's science fiction, but it's not science fiction in the speculative sense. This is a story about a small group of astronauts on a space station that's orbiting Earth, and the narration is omniscient, so we go into the different perspectives of the astronauts, and it just describes the Earth from this beautiful bird's eye view and the astronauts' backstories. And I did really enjoy listening to the audiobook, because I think that if I had have read the physical book to begin with, there are some moments that maybe, because there's a few like lists of things in the story, I feel like the emotional impact would have been less strong if I had have been reading it, because my attention span, if it's a list, my eyes will glaze over and I'll just start skipping through it. If I'm listening to an audiobook, I can't do that. And so I think there were some emotional punches that hit me harder because I was listening to a person read it to me. And I just had this moment towards the end of the story where I felt so moved by the book. Like I felt so grateful to be a human and grateful to be alive. And I was like, oh my God, we live on such a beautiful planet. And there's this bit in the story where the narrator was kind of listing things that are really important to the human race, and pyramids and this specific person and that specific person and this artist. And when you start having like the spirally thoughts on how fragile life is and how lucky we are to be here, like I start getting really emotional. When I read this book, it got me in this kind of really good vulnerable headspace where it really impacted me and it made me feel really grateful and happy. And book number 3 is called Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro, translated from the Spanish by Francis Riddle. I listened to the audiobook of this, and it's kind of rare that I put on an audiobook and it just captures my attention so extremely that I kind of have to stop what I'm doing and I just kind of sit there because I just want to keep listening to the audiobook. And this was very much my experience of listening to Elena Knows. So this is a story about a woman who has Parkinson's, who's in, from memory, her late 50s or early 60s. Like she's quite young to have been impacted so significantly. So this is a version of Parkinson's that doesn't involve tremoring. And right at the beginning of the story, Elena's daughter dies. And so Elena, who has this really significant illness and disability, has decided that she's going to go on this quest to work out who has killed her daughter and why her daughter has died. I love the voice of this story. I love the voice of Elena as a character. she's so pissed off all the time. Like, she just swears all the time. She's so outspoken and interesting, and I loved getting to be inside her head. And I also loved the way that this story depicted the effect of the Parkinson's on her life and how incredibly significant this was. The story kind of jumps back and forth between this one particular day where Elena's going out to go and find this person to speak to, and she kind of has to go across town, and the story is set in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. So we have all these flashbacks and these bits and pieces of her memory, but we keep coming back to this one central day where she's slowly moving through the city. And because obviously the version of Parkinson's that she has is so debilitating in terms of her physical access, it takes her a really long time to get anywhere or to do anything. The story does a really, really good job of showing how difficult this experience is for her and how much perseverance she has to have just to get through a normal day, just to get on a bus, just to get into a taxi. The story was beautifully told. It was tragic. It was fun. It was so funny. Like, Elena is a really, really funny character. There were so many things I thought were absolutely brilliant in this book. I couldn't put it down. It was so engagingly written, and I just thought it was absolutely excellent. So I really, really loved it. My top two books are honestly tied for first. It was really, really hard for me to say which book was definitively my favorite book of 2024. So I think depending on what day you asked me, it could be either of these two. So take this with a pinch of salt. Book number 2 and book number 1 are basically in the same spot, but I'll kick off by saying book number 2 is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, which I read in the same vlog where I was reading Orbital. So that was a really, really good reading vlog for me. But Our Wives Under the Sea is this amazing short novel about these two women and their relationship, and oh, the story is so good. It's so well written. And so we go back and forth between these two perspectives. And so Leah is a submariner and Miri is her wife. And so Miri's perspective is the present day perspective after her wife Leah has come back from her most recent submarine trip and something is clearly wrong. And then Leah's perspective is the day that the submarine went down. And so we keep jumping back to this one specific day and finding out the mystery of what happened. And then we jump back and forth and we get to see the backstory of their relationship and how they fell in love. It's this beautiful, beautiful, tragic, wonderful story. This book is tagged as horror, but personally, I wouldn't categorize it as horror. It wasn't scary. There were a few little things that were like a little bit creepy here, but I mean, I suppose there is some body horror elements going on here. So if you find that upsetting, maybe that might be a little bit scary to you, but I loved it. I thought it was so brilliantly told. I loved their relationship. I loved the prose here. The voice of the story was really good. There was some really clever and witty bits of writing in here. And overall, I just thought it was amazingly written, really engaging, really beautiful. And then my favorite book of the year, again, it could have easily been this one, and it is Strange Beasts of China by Yang Ge, translated from the Mandarin by Jeremy Tiang. I'm so glad I read it. It's this beautiful, beautiful story about this woman who is a cryptozoologist. So she studied cryptozoology at university, but ends up quitting her cryptozoology career and becomes a writer. And so in this book, she's detailing the strange beasts who live in the city that she lives in China, and the story is split up into the different beasts. And so we kick off with the sorrowful beasts, and then we go into the next kind of beast and the next kind of beast, and all of these beasts are quite humanoid, but they'll have a specific thing that's different with them. Like, they'll have like webbed arms, or their ears will be different, or like they won't be able to cry. And each chapter goes through a different kind of beast, and we follow the narrator and we find out more about her relationships and her history. The story is just brilliantly told. I did go and read some of the Goodreads reviews after I read this book and realized that it was incredibly divisive. Like, people either adored this book or they thought it was really, really boring and they couldn't get into it and they couldn't understand it. I think the best way to read this book is to read it kind of slowly and to keep an eye out for the subtext. I think because if you didn't pay attention to the subtext of this character's relationship to this person is this, so this means this and that means that, if you didn't pay attention to that kind of thing, you might not enjoy the story as much because you might not click when certain things get revealed in the story. I'm trying to be quite vague here. I loved the tone of this story. I loved the mildly forlorn vibe. I loved the setting. I love the gentle mythology bits here. I love the speculative elements. Like, I really, really do love it when a book like this understands that there are absolutely no rules for what you can write about in terms of a speculative story. The book is incredibly refreshingly unique. I love the end of the book. I love the twists and turns in the story. I love the characterization. I thought it was genuinely such a unique unique and vibrant and interesting speculative story, and I loved it to bits and I thought it was so good. That was a really, really good reading year, which is wonderful. Really, really quickly, I just wanted to mention my 5-star rereads this year, because from like an overconsumption perspective, I'm trying to keep encouraging myself to reread books, which can be a little bit hard when you're a book content creator, because you feel kind of pressured to just constantly be reading new stuff so that you have books that you can talk about. But I do think that you get a lot more out of books when you reread them for a second or a third time. Like, you learn a lot more from them. But anyway, the 5-star rereads that I had this year were Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Secret History by Donna Tartt, The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green, Starting Point by Hayao Miyazaki, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. So those were my other 5-star books that I read this year, but obviously those are rereads and I have mentioned them so many times on this channel, so I didn't want to bog down this list of new to me books with the books that I have read and reread many, many times. Please do feel free to let me know what books you loved in 2024. I love getting book recommendations from you guys, so please feel free to pop those in the comments down below. And also, before I go, I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting my videos. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without the beautiful people over on Patreon. So as a thank you to them, I upload a whole bunch of bonus content, bonus videos, writing updates. We have a book club. This month we're reading Days at the Murasaki Bookshop, which I can't wait to start reading with everyone. If you'd like to check out Patreon, there's a link in the description down below. Take care everyone, Happy New Year, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.